Hello and welcome to RUSI in London. I'm Neil Melvin, the Director of the International Security Studies team here. In today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the issue of integration in the North Caucasus. From today's perspective, against the background of the buildup of Russian military forces and around Ukraine and a very strong Russian state, it's perhaps hard to remember that just 20 years ago, many people thought there was a risk that the Russian Federation, the post-Soviet state that has emerged in the early 1990s, actually faced a real risk of fragmentation and breakup as it was challenged by regional movements emerging across the country. The center of this was focused on the North Caucasus, and we saw two violent confrontations, the two wars in Chechnya, but a set of other violent insurgencies that emerged across the North Caucasus from the 1990s and challenged directly Russia's rule. While the violence was often focused mostly in the region, Russia also experienced terrorism in the southern Russian areas, but in particular in Moscow and St. Petersburg as the conflicts of the North Caucasus moved north. So one of Vladimir Putin's central challenges when he rose to power at the end of the 1990s was to challenge the insurgencies of the North Caucasus and to pacify the region. Putin's approach to this has largely been successful in terms of suppressing violence and restoring a degree of stability across the region, but many of the deep-seated problems and structural challenges that brought forth the violence in the 1990s remain in the region and are largely unaddressed. So in today's discussion, we want to look a little bit at where does the region stand today, and in particular, how has Russia approached a longer-term approach to integration and stabilization in the North Caucasus. For this discussion, we're delighted to have joining us Yelena Zhirukina, Dr. Yelena Zhirukina, who's been with us at RUSI over the last year as a visiting fellow, supported by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and I'd like to thank FES for their support that's made possible this relationship. And Yelena has used the fellowship to produce two papers for us, very interesting papers, where she looks at how the Russian authorities have sought to approach this question of integration, and against the backdrop, I think, of the wider shift in Russia under President Putin, in which there's been a construction of a political order in Russia, the vertical of power, largely focused in many ways on dealing with the problems of the North Caucasus and their legacies. So in today's discussion, Yelena will first of all present some of her main findings, which are derived from her papers. And then we have Dr. Domitila Sagremoso, who's senior lecturer at King's College, an expert on Islamist and jihadi violence, particularly in the North Caucasus, who will comment on Yelena's papers and provide us some wider food for thought. So Yelena, welcome to our webinar today, and please introduce your papers.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Pleased to be here with you and also to contribute to the discussion on the Northern Caucasus. So then let me very briefly go to my comments. First of all, the two papers that you are now can find on the RUSI website, they were somewhat of a mapping exercise to see what it is that is important for the region, what are the remaining gaps that needs to be addressed. And the purpose of these publications is to stimulate a discussion, the broader discussion on the Northern Caucasus, which is absolutely fascinating region. It comes from my experience. It's very complicated, it's complex, but it's also rich, and it has a very great potential for the development. So I really hope that soon we can maybe shift the focus of our research from the security issues, the terrorism, the political violence, towards more of a maybe a creative economic approaches in the region and fantastic local projects. But at the moment, we are still quite far away from that research agenda. I would also like to say from the onset that the Northern Caucasus is a strategic region for the Russian Federation. And events that happened there, its violent history has been portrayed by the Russian state as an existential threat. And although nowadays you can see that there is a normalization agenda already in its full force, the region still retains its strategic importance for the Russian Federation. It should be also noted that we cannot assess the Northern Caucasus without into the broader trends of the Russian Federation. The Northern Caucasus is a part of Russia, right? So it is very likely that we will see all of the systematic troubles, all of the systematic problems that other Russian regions are facing in the Northern Caucasus, and from the experience of the previous years to the greater extent. The project that I conducted with Rusi investigated what is actually is the current vision of the integration efforts, and if there are such, by the Russian state, and what are the policies that shall be prioritized by the Russian state to ensure the regional peace and prosperity. And of course, there is a progress that has been achieved in the region, and there is no point in denying that there is such a progress. However, we are so far still till that state that we can call peace and prosperity in the Northern Caucasus. Some mutual challenges are still there. Corruption, of course, that undermines economic efforts, that undermines the accountability of the local governance, various irregularities of the law enforcement that just provokes the mistrust of the population towards the agencies that should be responsible for their security. And sometimes we can see the backlash reactions as well. But also in the culture, we see that there is still somewhat a mental border between the rest of Russia and the Northern Caucasus, and hopefully it will disappear in the years to come. So in my papers, I looked at the political, security, and economic dimensions of the integration efforts, but also into the discourse and the perceptions, culture, and language. And when we are thinking about the integration efforts or the integration model, or some other term to name it, we can think of a certain policy that are in between of the unification and uniqueness. We need both. We need to have unification because the Northern Caucasus is part of the Russian Federation. It should be well integrated within the legal space, within the political space, within the cultural space. However, the Northern Caucasus has a lot to offer in terms of its very specific features, and it shall be preserved as well. So the economic competitiveness also can come from the distinctiveness of this region, and provided for the separatist sentiments that were there in the past, it's very important to keep that possibility to be unique within the whole Russian family. However, it also provides certain challenges. Yes, we need to situate our policy somewhat between the unification and preservation of the uniqueness. But to what extent the approach can be unified? The Northern Caucasus is very diverse. It's a very difficult region. It has a lot of local dynamics, right? So maybe a unified approach would not quite work because the needs of the different elements of the Northern Caucasus, the national republics, are different. However, some of the problems are common for the region, and those problems can be addressed by the governmental policies in a more systematic way. What I also want to note before we go on into the questions and the further discussion is that we need to remember that even though the region can find economic competitiveness in its distinctive features, we still need to pay attention on the modernization and the development. So we should not look into the distinctiveness of the region only from its traditional perspective. We need to ensure that there is a modernization, the development, but also that there is a possibility to preserve the regional identities. In short, some of the main findings, and then we can probably discuss them within our dedicated time in a little bit more details. In the political dimension, we can see that there is a growing need and a growing demand in the renewed legitimacy of the local governments, but also accountability. There is a need in the safe environment for channeling the public feedback. And of course, with that, we see a lot of troubles and no surprise since the channeling the public feedback in the rest of the Russia becomes very difficult, and the open space for that, for the various activities, and especially the protest movements, is shrinking in Russia. So we can imagine that in the Northern Caucasus, it's even more complicated. Then from the security perspective, we of course need to see that there is a systematic investigation of violations of the human rights, of the various irregularities that happen within the investigation process, but also within the judicial system. And of course, ideally, we need to come to the more accountable law enforcement that can help to nurture the trust between the security agencies and also develop a culture of lawfulness. In economic dimension, of course, corruption, it's a big issue still, although a lot of efforts are now being invested into the region to fight corruption. It's still there, and it utilizes upon the various local networks. We need to see that there is a possibility for the bottom up, but not only the top down, right, economic development, but also for a certain local projects that can provide for that wonderful potential that is out there in the region, also turn it into the economic development. In the discourse, we can see that there is a need in the normalization of the regional agenda and balancing between the negative and the positive news that are coming from the region, but also showing the success stories, which are very important. They're there, but sometimes they got overlooked by the media. In the culture and the language, I hope we will discuss it a little bit in more detail. We can also see that there is a need for the further support for the local languages, the national languages in the national republics, but also promotion of the Russian language and the Russian culture. I would just conclude by saying that in the Northern Caucasus, we can see a lot of policies that provided a short-term solutions. But now we need to think about the long term. So the policies that worked within an environment of the almost everyday political violence, they cannot work any longer because the situation changed. So, and I think nowadays it's a very good opportunity to turn the long-term success into the, the short-term success into the long-term success. So thank you, and I think I will finish here and will be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elena. And I think, I mean, as you've mentioned here, but also as you highlight in your papers, you see the challenge very much as a comprehensive challenge that integration needs to take place across a whole range of issues. I'll pass over to Domitila in a second, but could I just remind the audience that we will have a chance for you to ask questions and make comments. So please use the Q&A function. There's already some questions and comments coming in there. And once we finish the formal presentation part, I'll start asking our panelists some of those issues. So please do start posting your questions now. But with that, perhaps I could turn to Domitila for your comments.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly? Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. I think there's such fascinating ideas in your work, and I think I would like to highlight points that you have emphasized that I have encountered during my travels to the region, primarily to the eastern North Caucasus. Issues around corruption remain very, very serious and very severe. lack of effective economic development, a sense of isolation of this region from not only the rest of Russia, but from other markets, from other sort of points or areas of economic development. And from the political point of view, a sort of a lack of accountability of the authorities, but more importantly, sort of a lack of, in my view, of popular legitimacy. So the so-called the vertical of power creates some very sort of serious issues. They're different in each republic. The areas that I have focused on more are Chechnya and Dagestan. And here, sort of, on the one hand, we have a leader who is sort of appointed by Moscow in Dagestan, who is sort of half Russian. It's not even clear if he's a Muslim. And of course, in Chechnya, we have the very robust and quite brutal rule of Ramzan Kadyrov, and that really, you know, the sort of his use of very harsh methods to keep power raise serious issues around legitimacy. Another point that I would like to highlight is the difficulty of creating a sort of a unified legal space, because as we know, for example, in some parts of Dagestan, we see really the sort of the introduction and the use of either traditional methods of resolution of conflicts according to local traditions or so-called adat, but also the use of Sharia law in certain villages. So this brings me a bit to my area of work, which is the fact that culturally, as you say, I think there is still an increasing sort of divergence when we look at the population. And here I will talk a bit more about the research that I've been carrying out with Dr. Ahmed Yarlikapov, where we've really looked a bit at sort of how Muslim communities are developing. And what we note, of course, when we look at government policy is that the government, the Russian government and the local governments, they support very much what we would call sort of traditional forms of Islam around, for example, in Dagestan, around the structures of Sufism and of the Sufi Sheikh Ahmed Haji Abdullayev. We know in Chechnya there is strong backing of Sufi Islam, of the Wird, of the Qadiriya Tariqat of Ramzan Kadyrov. And this really sometimes sort of creates cleavages, not only because, for example, in Dagestan, there are also followers of other sheikhs who challenge these sheikhs, which are sort of backed by the official authorities. So there are sort of countercurrents even within the more traditional forms of Islam. There are efforts by Dagestani official Muslims to spread their sort of forms or schools of Islam, of Shafi Islam, further to the east by trying to promote Shafi Islam in areas of, in the west of the North Caucasus, in areas which are traditionally followers of the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam. There's also the challenge and the growing penetration of Shia Islam. So this is to show that the mosaic is extremely complex. And in Chechnya, there is a lot of concern about the penetration of Shia Islam, and there's a lot of effort to challenge this. But at the same time, what our research is showing us is that there is still sort of an appeal of different forms of Salafi Islam, which are no longer violent, as was rightly mentioned by Neil Melvin. The counter-insurgency operations were quite effective, especially around the Sochi Olympics, and that really sort of put a bit of an end to the more sort of effective insurgency of the Caucasus Emirate. There were even sort of quite successful efforts to eliminate so-called ISIS cells in the North Caucasus, although there are still sympathizers. And what our research is showing very much is that you know, there is also a variety of Salafi currents, and they range from those who are very strict, the so-called madhab deniers, those who do not support the existence or accept the existence of different forms of Sunni jurisprudence. Those who are ready to adopt a bit more of a moderate stance, the Madkhalids, who still adhere to very strict forms of the Hanbali madhab, which is prevalent also in other parts of the Middle East. And what is really interesting is that we really see a very strong support among Salafis for what we call Ikhwanized Salafis, or the followers of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. And what is very interesting to me is that increasingly among these more sort of moderate Salafis and followers of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, also many are following Salafi sheikhs in Saudi Arabia, like Sheikh Mohammed Al-Arif or Sheikh Salman Al-Auda, who are sort of very famous Salafi sheikhs in Saudi Arabia. So what we are really seeing is that so these forms of Salafi Islam, which are not necessarily violent, they accept the role of the authorities, but they would like to sort of introduce a very traditional or orthodox Salafi creed, challenge very much the realities of the existing sort of arrangements of the North Caucasus, and create very strong ties between the populations of the North Caucasus and other areas of the sort of the broader Middle East. And this is seen also sometimes in official positions, such as those taken by the leader of Chechnya, who wants to portray himself and Chechnya as a sort of as a center of Sufi Islam, and spreads sort of its rays and its efforts to engage. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that sort of there is a cultural sort of cleavage that is growing. There is a perception by inhabitants in these regions that they belong culturally to a different space, a sort of different civilizational space. Language issues are a question, but to me, you know, from my experiences, you know, the levels of religiosity, especially in Dagestan, you know, place the region in a very distinct sort of cultural framework, and at the moment, I find it very hard to see how a real integration can occur, especially because, as Yelena has highlighted, there are serious issues around sort of the political organization, the lack of trust in the authorities, the lack of accountability, the difficulties of developing effective economic projects. A lot of funding is going to these regions, but it doesn't always materialize in long-term projects. We can see little sort of hubs of local development, and there are areas that are growing, especially when we think about the sort of the areas around Makhachkala, the port, and there are regions that one can see that have a very strong potential, and in that I fully agree with Elena. I think there is a very strong potential for this region, but as long as it remains unstable to a certain extent, we know a very high number of Muslims from these regions went to fight with ISIS in the 2013s, 2015s. There was a lot of appeal of ISIS Islam. It remains problematic, and I just finished with the understanding that you know, if we look at for example at events in Afghanistan, there is some evidence that there is support, for example, for the Taliban takeover as an example of sort of decolonization. So among many in the North Caucasus, especially in Chechnya. So I think that these kind of events, although we might not see the impact immediately, might have an effect in the long term, because they sort of bolster the idea that insurgencies potentially can dislodge sort of foreign occupiers. So even if they might not agree with a form of Islam that is implemented in Afghanistan by the Taliban, there are sympathies with movements that dislodge sort of the foreign powers. And I think this sentiment is still quite strong. among many quarters, and the perception that they are not necessarily minorities, they are majorities in their own territories. And I think these challenges are going to remain very strong as long as the internal structures of the Russian state remain so authoritarian. Of course, the risk is if we open up and we allow for stronger sort of political pluralism and participation, we find ourselves again in the situation we found ourselves in the early 1990s, where political mobilization occurs primarily along nationalist or religious lines. And that can lead again to separatism. And I think this is the biggest challenge, that in these regions, there wasn't a possibility to create a broad spectrum of political parties from left to right with different agendas. A lot of the political mobilization occurred primarily, if not exclusively, along ethno or ethno-religious lines. And I think I'm going to stop now. I'm very sorry I went a bit over my time. Thank you, Mimi.
No, thank you very much, Domitilla. I think it was very good that you sketched out, well, and sort of underlined the complexity of the North Caucasus, its diversity, and the range of issues from the bottom-up perspective. We've got a few questions already, but perhaps I could just start with a couple of questions of my own. And I think you both highlighted that the region is a very diverse one, and it's underneath the label of the North Caucasus. There are a lot of different communities, different interests. It's also a region that, despite the kind of the image of pacification and stabilization, has a lot of dynamism, including, as Domitilla mentioned, in the cultural and religious sense. So my first question is really this concept of integration and how useful that is for understanding what is actually happening. Because in the Western concept, or the European concept of integration, is often one about a balance between rights of national minorities and their responsibilities to the broader state. But the model that seems to have emerged in Russia is a different one, in which obviously coercion has been the core issue, in which stabilization has been achieved initially by the massive use of state security power in respect of the North Caucasus. Secondly, there seems to have been a sort of a political patronage network created from Moscow into the region, an elite bargain, if you like, and then some kind of social compact in which large-scale resources are transferred from Moscow to the region, economic ones. So my question is how stable actually is this model, since a lot of it seems to be based around President Putin and his system that he's corrupted. It's not necessarily an institutionalized system or a rule of law-based system, which is the underpinnings for the Western integration model. So I'd be interested to know Yelena and Domitilla's sort of view on whether how much this really depends on the current political order in Moscow, and if that changes, is there a long-term sustainable integration model now in place for the North Caucasus? And linked to that is an issue, I think, which also we see in some of the question, which is the ethno-federal question, which of course was at the heart of the initial upswing in violence in the early 1990s, even if it did transform into a more Islamist direction later on. But under President Putin, there's been a growing stress on Russian language. The Russian ethnic community is a state-forming community. And of course, we even see in the foreign policy around Ukraine an idea of almost a regathering of the Russian ethnic lands. And this was very, very clear in President Putin's famous speech about Crimea annexation in 2014. Underpinning the kind of I guess, the decoupling of the North Caucasus from Russia has been a long-term departure of ethnic Russians and Slavs from the North Caucasus. So is there really now a basis for integrating the North Caucasus through this Russian, kind of a Russian identity and a Russian language, when many of these structural bases are being sort of questioned? And so how do you actually reconcile minority languages, ethnic identities, and religious identities in the North Caucasus, which increasingly look in divergence with the Russian state building project that President Putin is pushing forward at the moment. So I don't know whether Yelena or Domitila want to reply to those while we get some more questions coming in, and then I'll open it up to the wider conversation. Do you want to go first, Yelena?
Sure. So I think it's a very good question, and it's basically at the core of the developments in the region. So, and it also, I think it very well reflects the discrepancies between the short term and the long term. What the Russian government tried to do in the Northern Caucasus is to reach the pacification as soon as possible. And probably at the moment, we need already to start moving from the position where the region does not cause a problem to the position that the region is well integrated, and it can sustain itself, but it also can contribute to the Russian state. Because if you look at the economy, most of the republics are very much dependent on the federal budget. And of course, it is to say that it's not so surprising. In Russia, only 13 regions are donors. The rest, they receive help from the government. However, in the Northern Caucasus, the percentage of that help is quite high. So it's from the 50 to 90 percentage of the dependence. It means that although investments in the region, they're quite vast and diverse, and so you can see the development on the different tracks, agriculture, manufacturing, the tourism, education, health, everything, like, it's quite comprehensive, right? However, at the same time, we do not see that there is that growth of the potential. So the potential is still not quite utilized. So the regions, they're doing their first steps towards becoming more sustained regions, right? So that they can produce a certain value and contribute to the federation. However, it's still very limited, which means then that the economic programs are somewhat not very effective in the region. And also, if you look at the statistics, most of the economic projects and the investment projects, they have somewhat modest results, which is a problem. And then regarding the system of coercion, I think it's another very important issue. So successful pacification of, and we can argue what it means to have a success in terms of the counterterrorism practices. Okay, we have less violence, much less violence than in the previous years. Some isolated incidents at the moment. We know that there is a lot of preventive work happening. We know that there is also a new challenger, which is the ISIS in the region. It has quite a large impact. And all of that we can call a success. However, as Domitila was saying, if there is that risk of things going back to a political violence, it means that suppressing is not a solution. It might help in the short term. And nowadays, yes, of course, we don't see as much of the political violence, but then does it mean that we will not see it in the years to come? If it's gonna be any, inspiring event, as Domitila mentioned, events in Afghanistan, or maybe certain processes, the worsening of the economic situation in the region, and so on and so forth. So suppression is not going to help in the long term. What's going to help is actually the meaningful integration of the various communities. What's going to help is the provision of the economic opportunities for young people, because we have a lot of young, educated people, but not that much of the economic opportunities. They have a very high rates of the unemployment in the region. And when we have a lot young, educated people with the ideas, with the drive, without the social mobility and possibility to find, the place in the economic system, that can create a problem. It also can drive people towards a more radical thinking and more radical approaches. Regarding the question on the Russian project of the project of the Russian nation, I do not see the problem here as long as there is a place for the diversity. As long as there is a possibility for the minorities to be well represented, and as long as there is a possibility for the national languages to be promoted, then the Russian project can work well, because what the Russian project means, it's unity and diversity. It's not the very narrow Ruski, right? It's the Российский, the Russian nation project, not about the Russian ethnic. However, with that representation of the minorities and the various identities, and especially the Matilda mentioned very well regarding the religious diversity, and also the resentment of the current system towards those new developments, right, towards the new groups, or the possibility for them to find their own place within that system. This is a question, and it's cause problems, and also has a conflict potential. So I think I will stop here.
Thanks, Domitila. Do you want to come in on this?
Thank you. Just would like to add, because Elena covered quite a lot, but first of all, I would like to highlight that the North Caucasus itself is very varied. And if we look at the regions in the western sides of the North Caucasus, there are bigger so-called Russian, ethnic Russian inhabitants. Many are sort of heirs of the early Cossack deployments, so they feel very much that this is their original land, especially if we look at the regions of, for example, Karachar-Cherkessia and around Adygea. So I think that we really need to be careful that there is a lot of variety throughout the region. If we go further to the east, I think that the cultural, religious identities, I'm not saying are stronger, but they are less sort of related to Russia. And I think that the sentiments of distinctiveness are probably much stronger, also because if we look at the western parts of the North Caucasus, around the whole sort of Stavropol region and Krasnodar region, we can see that there are more relevant sort of poles of development. But still in Adygea, for example, the sentiments of their national identity and of the need to preserve this identity are strong, and that explains why there was such an uproar many years ago when there was a plan to sort of merge these two regions, Krasnodar and Adygea. So I think that that this is the first element to bear in mind, that I think that we cannot, I mean, I don't think we can devise a single policy towards the entire region, besides the sort of broad lines of investment and sort of and a more open environment. The second point is that I think that even though I described a sort of a cultural religious cleavage, there are still what I would call sort of pockets of modernity. So these societies that are very traditional, they coexist with elements that are looking very much at a sort of a modern way of life, that are eager to sort of integrate more sort of in a global world, so to say, around more secular models of development. And there is this cohabitation, and these are sort of communities where sort of there is a possibility to see that they become sort of further integrated into sort of the Russian cultural economic space, in sense of feeling really part of it. And I think, of course, there is, at the moment, the sort of the model is very much allowing for sort of maybe cultural, to a certain extent, religious autonomy, religious within certain parameters. But of course, as you rightly explain, Neil, there are these very tenuous sort of elite bargains, transfer of cash. So it's a bit of a stick and carrot arrangement. And I really don't know how long they can last, because they are really based very much on very harsh law enforcement measures. In Dagestan, for example, we have lists of individuals who are considered at risk. These individuals face a lot of problems if they want to travel outside of the region, if they want to open a bank account, if they want to engage in economic activities, because they're seen as suspicious of potentially engaging in subversive activities around sort of violent insurgencies. And these individuals and these lists and these groups sort of create a group of citizens that are sort of marginal, because they are not able really to become engaged in effective economic activities. So many of these measures that are introduced from the point of view of, I would call sort of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, they have a very direct impact also on the economic lives of these individuals, because they are in this sort of blacklist and they cannot develop an effective economic life. So it's very hard to disentangle the structure of law enforcement and the political structures from sort of other areas of development and economic progress. I think that there is a chance to open up and to allow for a bit more pluralism, which was tried to a certain extent for example, in Dagestan in the 2010s, and I think that would allow for a more effective sort of form of integration. I think the current model of this sort of vertical of power, which is never really vertically implemented locally, but still exists, I think is a real challenge. Is a real challenge in an area like the North Caucasus.
Okay, thanks very much. Perhaps I'll take some questions then. So if I can group a couple together. The first, I think, set of questions really concerns this long-term legacy of violent groups, or certainly armed groups. And so Rafael Moreto asks about the presence of non-state armed groups in the region. How best can these be approached, I guess, demobilized or perhaps disarmed, and sort of how they intersect with organized crime and I guess corruption that sort of pervades certain parts of the region. So I suppose in a way there's a question here about what is the actual driver of violence? Is it criminality and sort of organized groups, or is there a kind of grievance around Islam or ethnicity or something else? And then I think links into this issue that Harold Chambers raises, which he notes that in Makhachkala and Karachay-Cherkessia, there's been the first counterterrorism operations in half a decade this year, and he's asking whether this is an indication that well, violence is rising and possibly a return to some of the more politicized violence that we saw in the 90s and early 2000s. And the second, I think, cluster of issues I want to take now is the issue of human rights. And so Ollie Phelan asks, how can the international community, including the UK, support better human rights in North Caucasus? Of course, there was a huge effort in the 1990s around civil society support for the region and the big international engagement. That was steadily closed off by the Russian government. And of course, the whole sort of foreign agent law makes it very difficult for, I think, that those kind of engagements. So how do you see that issue advancing? Of course, you've seen Memorial, the long-term human rights group in Russia, its future sort of engraved out now. So even indigenous human rights organizations struggling. And that links into an issue, I think, which we haven't touched on yet, which is really the gender dimension in the region. So Anna Chernova argues about women's rights and gender justice, which she says is in decline in Russia more generally. And I think obviously this is another dimension of President Putin's rule, which has had a very strong kind of patriarchal dimension to it. How does that then affect stability and development in the North Caucasus? So perhaps we could take those two clusters of issues. I don't know whether perhaps in reverse order, Domitilla, did you want to respond to them? And then I'll ask Elena, and then we'll take another round of questions.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you very much. So very interesting questions. To the question of whether there are still sort of clusters of violence, yes, I mean, this has never completely disappeared from the picture. There are elements that are still able to exert violence, but the levels are much more reduced. And the Caucasus Emirate was very much sort of to a certain extent annihilated because a lot of its leaders were killed. Many of the sort of the foreign jihadists who were very relevant in sort of in the mobilization of these groups have also been eliminated. So we don't see a very strong sort of foreign presence there. Although a lot of the recruitment occurs through different methods, through social media platforms, videos. So there's not necessarily a need for a standing presence from abroad, but recruiters we know were there during the period when ISIS was very strong. So these kind of events in the neighborhood of the North Caucasus certainly become inspiring, and they lead to many. What was interesting is that in the North Caucasus, many went to live to Syria and Iraq, not necessarily to fight, but to live in an Islamic state where they felt that they were not going to be persecuted. So there is a constituency of individuals that feel that they cannot live their religious life in the way they would like to. And if there are repressions, the cycle of violence could escalate. Whether the factors are, the reasons why there are these violent developments, I think, are multifaceted. There might be always an element of corruption and of sort of a criminal dimension in these attacks. That's always been present. It is nothing new. There are criminal networks that are very powerful. And especially in Dagestan, and these can be sort of exerting violence. In Chechnya, we have a much more effective sort of vertical of power locally. Issues of an economic dimension are relevant, but in terms of a perception, what my colleague Ahmed would call the lack of social escalators. So even individuals that are quite well off economically, they might be funding these groups, or they might be attracted to these groups because they perceive that they cannot maybe occupy a particular role in society. So although as a whole sort of economic factors and underdevelopment play a part, they are not in themselves the only element. They create a sort of a structural reality and a perception of lack of prospects. And of course, the ideologies remain very powerful, and ISIS gave a really significant boost. That's why I'm personally very concerned about developments in Afghanistan, because they can give a boost of an alternative model, especially if these kind of models are seen as successful. I mean, we might not perceive them as such. We might never have perceived the Islamic State as successful, but the propaganda of the Islamic State was very effective. It really created the impression that there was a possibility to live in an Islamic State. And I think that is something that we really need to consider, because the narratives and the framing is still there, it's still powerful, and there is still a lot of engagement and interconnection with Islamist developments in the broader Islamic world, in Saudi Arabia. That's why I mentioned these followers of Saudi sheikhs, because it seems clearly that there is a connection. So I wouldn't discard the return to violence, but I think at the moment, I don't see that reaching the levels of the late 1990s, 2000s. On the question of gender, I really haven't looked at this question, so I don't feel comfortable, giving an answer, because it would be very superficial. And it would be just my own impression. So I don't know if maybe Yelena has looked at this in greater detail. Quickly on the question of human rights, this remains an issue of grave concern, and the local structures are not able to provide an answer. There have been efforts to go to the European, the Council of Europe courts, but of course the decisions which were introduced in the Russian constitution that the Russian laws are going to be superior to international laws and regulations, were also directed at many decisions that had been taken by the judicial structures of the Council of Europe, especially regarding these cases. So I think that this is a bit of an avenue that has been closed to them. So that's another issue of discontent and concern. I talked to many human rights lawyers in Dagestan, and there seemed to be a great sense of frustration around the sort of the possibility of really protecting human rights.
Thanks, Yelena. Do you want to add anything to this?
So I think Domitila covered it quite well. I just add some of the points. Haven't looked into the relationship between the violent non-state actors in the Northern Caucasus and the criminality in the recent years, but I've done quite a substantive research from the 2007 to 2015. That's basically the time of the Caucasian Emirate in full force. And from that time period, I can say that the illegal armed groups quite used the criminal methods to raise funds. So what they did, they tried to persuade local business to give them money, so-called taxes, by, of course, violent incidents. So they would be placing an improvised explosive device nearby shop door, or target the shop owner or the business owner, not quite kill, maybe injured, maybe just frightened, but kind of send the message that it's much better that you would provide us with some funds. So that system of the taxation on the business, and not only on the business, but on the people who actually have the financial possibility to contribute, was present within their strategy. Whether does it make them criminal groups? I don't know, but for sure they used that strategy. So they used it as a tool to fund themselves. And especially during that period, we can see that there was a lack of foreign funding coming into the region. It wasn't, the same level as in 90s or early 2000s, and especially from the Middle East and the Gulf countries. So they had to raise local funds, and they would use, of course, local business to raise those funds. I would also probably reiterate the point on injustice and the grievances as a driver of violence. And that basically concerns a lot the counterterrorism policies, right? The types of the operations that they were conducted and the way they were conducted. Since there were a lot of what we call irregularities, but basically human rights violations within the investigation process, people, even though they might be innocent, they were very harshly treated, mistreated, and sometimes even tortured. And you can find a lot of accounts of that collected by the human rights organizations in the region. And the just sheer volume of the applications to the European Court of Human Rights with very detailed accounts of what has been done behind the closed doors, when people even disappeared and the relatives could not even know where they're buried. And even if those suspected people survived, they would have go through a very severe treatment. So this type of that basically also concerns the human rights issue within the counterterrorism, but this is a driver of violence too. So when even innocent people got into those circles of law enforcement irregularities, they are very likely to come out of it, if alive, right, with a very different perception of a state and what can state do, and then whether the state can be a security provider at all. So I guess systematic investigations of the irregularities within the law enforcement is very important. It's one of the key moments that can actually help to reduce any potential risk of the future violence, the political violence occurring in the region again. But for that, I think a lot of reformation of the way of the developed tactics and developed practices that are tolerated by the system, that this should be changed. On the human rights issue, I think it's quite important also to mention the amendment of the Constitution, the recent amendment that now in our Constitution, of course, it's not in use, right? It's been already accepted from 2015, I think, by the Constitutional Court, that the decisions of the international organizations, if they go into conflict with the interpretation of the Russian constitutions, they might be, not implemented. So there is that higher level of the Russian internal national law. And what it means that there is a possibility of the much reduced access towards to the international justice for the Russian citizens. Plus, here we can mention the foreign agents law that basically very much limits the possibility of the human rights, the national human rights organizations to help people even apply for the some international justice institutions. So there is a kind of a shrinking space for an international justice in the region, and this is an issue as well. So in the shall we say, a restricted amount of the national justice and the decreasing access to the international justice, then the region is basically left on its own. And provided that it can be one of those issues, pushing for the political violence, this is an issue, that's a concern. So this is a vicious circle happening inside of the country. I also cannot think that I can comment in the meaningful way on the gender issue. Probably just a little bit in a broader sense that Russia is a very traditional society still. So we have at the Russian level, right? So it's not even in the Northern Caucasus, which is super traditional region, but in Russia itself, we have a lot of gender issues. A lot of discrimination and the gender stereotypes is still in place. So I think to the extent that it's very much the all-Russian issue, including the gender-based violence at home, which is a taboo, almost a taboo issue to discuss. We can imagine what happens within the Northern Caucasus. But of course, again, I cannot comment into the details because I'm not researching that issue so closely. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, and clearly an hour isn't enough to discuss the North Caucasus. It's a bit out of the headlines these days, but I think both Yelena and Domitila have done a great job in highlighting that actually it remains a key issue in Russia and for the future of Russia. It's where many of the questions that people used to focus on in the past haven't gone away. We also haven't had time to really get into all the questions. And I think there were some which I would just like to highlight. I think it's still relevant for our future discussions. There's one, I think, from Tupal Ali, who I think highlights this issue of the future of Sufism, which often was seen, I think, as a factor of stability in some areas, and whether that is under challenge in Chechnya and Ingushetia. There's this, I think, a very interesting question, which comes from someone called Jay Taylor, who asks about what the relationship is between what Russia is doing in the North Caucasus and what's happening in Ukraine. I guess he means perhaps the Donbass in particular and Crimea, which suggests, I mean, that to understand some of these issues, there is a wider context of Russia's relationships, not just internally, but to places like Abkhazia, South Ossetia, which may come into the North Caucasus if it is linked to North Ossetia, to Transnistria and so on. So the state formation model that Russia has developed is a complicated one that has both internal but also extraterritorial aspects these days. And so to understand these issues, I think it's good to look at that in a comparative way. And of course, there is also, we haven't got time to go into the COVID issue. So I think very clearly, Yelena, you've done a great job in reminding us about the importance of the North Caucasus. And it's been, I think, great to have you as part of the Russi family over the last year writing on these issues. So we certainly hope to return to them again. But for now, I'd like to thank both of our presenters for giving us a great discussion today, to the audience for their very interesting questions, and to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for making all this possible over the last year. We look forward to working with them on future joint projects with our research colleagues in the Russian Federation. But for now, it's goodbye